Welcome to episode 76 of Tales from the Bridge. Kate Elliott is on the show today, and I have to say, Kate is one of the most fun guests we've had on the show. We really appreciate the time we had with Kate. We hope you get something out of this one, because we sure did. Check the show notes for a link to Kate's work and more. If you have not yet, subscribe, review the show, rate the show, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. Kate's waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
Joining us today is science fiction and fantasy author Kate Elliott. Kate has been publishing award-winning books for over 30 years and has won enough Locus Awards to fill Bag End. You may know her from the New York Times bestselling series Court of Fives. That said, her catalog is incredibly extensive. Her latest sci-fi is called Furious Heaven and is the second installment of the Sun Chronicles series. The space opera has been winning accolades from the likes of Anne Leckie and many more. If you're fans of Arkady Martin and James Corey, and you should be, you will find yourself in good hands with this series. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I wonder if we could start off with the latest from the Kahonian Empire. Can you remind our listeners of where we left off and where we can expect to go in this latest work without any spoilers?
Well, I would probably like to start with book one, briefly, Unconquerable Sun. And I'm just going to talk really briefly for those who haven't read the series. I decided some time ago to write a space opera that was gender swapped Alexander the Great in space, mostly because I originally got interested in the successor wars of all the generals who fought over the empire after Alexander the Great's death, which is not a spoiler because that was like over 2,000 years ago. And I thought, how great would this be in space? But then, because Alexander the Great, for good or for ill, is that kind of personality that kind of absorbs all the light and pulls everything in, I said to myself, well, I need to start at least to show the Alexander analog. And then now suddenly it's all about this person instead of all my other plans. So it was kind of hijacked. And it's split into three. So the first book is what I call Young Alexander. The analog character is named Sun. And it kind of deals with her I do a lot of historical adaptation and paralleling without adhering exactly to the history because it's not possible, because I've translated it into this other setting, this far future setting. And so that's book one. It's kind of a young Alexander, so like 2021. And then book two is what happens next. And Furious Heaven is what happens next. And there's a lot of war and a lot of battles and a lot of Sun deciding that she can do things that everyone tells her no one can do.
Is it common, like when you start with sort of one intention, that it kind of takes you somewhere else, where you were thinking of Alexander as your central character and then your central character sort of changes as you work through it? Is that just something you roll with, or does it end up upending the creative process a little bit?
I always hope the creative process is upended in the process of it. I always feel like if I adhere too rigidly to my original plan, then something got blocked. Because for me as a writer, the process of writing is part of the creative process, and things change. I'm an athlete, and things change as I move. So as I work, stuff will come up, and ideas that I could never have had at the beginning will kind of emerge. Things will happen an example would be in book 4 of my Geron sequence, which is also space opera / planetary romance. That book is from a long time ago. But an event happens in book 4 that I didn't intend. I didn't plan for it, but everything that had been set up made it happen. And I remember literally when I was at that point in the book and I said, oh, fuck. And I didn't want this thing to happen, but it happened. And I realized that there was no way out. I had set it up in such a way. And so, for Sun, the Alexander analog, Sun, to kind of take over the book and say, you need to write about me, everything centers around me, is a good thing, I think. Or it's a thing, right? And then I end up writing into the story. So I'm both. Sometimes people ask me if I'm a pantser or a plotter, but I'm neither one of those. I have ideas about what I want to do, and then I'm also kind of discovering what the story is unfolding for me, because my subconscious is making connections all the time while I'm working. So anyway, that's why I love writing. If I could just write something that was outlined, because I have those skills now to just be able to write down through. I could write something readable, but to me, the magic happens when you just kind of get blindsided by things you didn't expect in the process of moving through it.
And that's going to be difficult too, though. I still think of like the space. It's such a big story, right? And so many, and with the storylines, and so is it easy to lose track and lose the thread on one piece of the storyline? And you have something that sort of gets hung out there, and you realize I've got to bring that back. Like, do you run into those sort of? It almost feels like math at that point to sort of bring something in that might be left out there, or is that not as common as I imagine in my head?
Oh, no, it's as common. And that's one reason that trilogies or 5 books turn into 5-book series or 7-book series or 10-book series. Sometimes I think for writers, this is a complicated question. I think it's easy to get distracted by tangents. It's also possible to say that you want a multi-threaded plot, a narrative, that you want to set everything out and then make sure you pull it all back in at the end. And I think actually Furious Heaven does it well, if I must say so myself, because there is a lot of plot threads in Furious Heaven. There are a lot of characters, and I do bring them back all to where I want them to be at the end, in the place I want them to be there. And some part of it is that I make, like I have a notebook where I have all these plot threads, but a lot of it just goes on in my mind. And part of it is just that it's how my mind works. Another writer won't want to write that way. They'll write a more linear plot, just a few characters, and what their goals are different. But remember that I wrote a 7-volume epic fantasy, and it was a lot. And there was a lot going on in that. And I don't know, my brain just works that way. So in general, I have to, it hurts to try to bring it when you're struggling to make sure you've got everything coming back, but it also happens to be kind of how I work.
And I think readers also appreciate that. Like, I know for myself, I love those moving parts that start to reveal themselves and then they come together, and I kind of like to try to follow those as a reader. I find it interesting. And I know others don't as much. They're like a more of a linear plot. So it sounds like there's a different author for different readers. That's interesting to hear how you keep track of it. We actually did an interview recently with Martha Wells, and she was talking about the plotting it out versus the kind of free flow approach, and she has never been able to plot it out. She's always kind of gone through and just see what emerges. And I couldn't imagine, like, your mind, obviously it works differently, and you've had a lot of experience with all the books that you've written. But yeah, keeping track of all that sounds like a furious task, a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do write things down because I can lose track of things, but there is something else going on. And Martha, who I know, Martha's a friend of mine. She's a fantastic writer. I love her. I love her and I love her work. And there is something that goes on with some writers. And I mean, I'm assuming every writer writes a little differently, but there is something that just goes on in the brain where, I don't know, those connections meet up. And it is like a puzzle, but it's also, well, as I said before, I love the challenge of it. Can I bring this all in, without doing it mechanically? Can I trust myself? I work a lot on instinct, where I'll say, you know what, why did I open this door? Well, I'm just going to see what happens. And then sure enough, 300 pages later, it's like, oh, that's why. So, I mean, and I love that. So for me, there's a lot of pleasure in that, even while I'm also like beating my head bloody against the wall.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. Like, you've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
Does that mean a lot of revision and, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, and going back a few chapters, or are you finding you're able to kind of just do that without a ton of backtracking?
For me, the revision process is pretty complicated and it differs in books. Some books I just write straight through and then I go back and rewrite, but at least that's how I used to work. Now I'm more likely, and with Furious Heaven, I spent like 6 months writing the first 50 to 80,000 words, and Furious Heaven's a really long book. I call it like Sandersonian length, although actually I was writing that long before he was born, probably. I don't know. And I couldn't get it lined up right. I knew the plot, I knew the characters, I knew where everyone needed to do, but I had to get it. It's like I had to get it angled right, and I just couldn't figure it out. And then I sent early partial, like these first 50, 60,000 words to my editor, and she made one comment, and I thought, that's it. And so I was able to line everything up on that one plot point. And once I did that, I wrote like 200,000 words in 10 months because I knew exactly what I needed to do. So sometimes it's that getting it lined up right. If you get it lined up right, then you can make it work. Sometimes, like with Black Wolves, which is epic fantasy, I wrote the book and then I did like 3 major revision passes. I moved stuff around. I had to, because it included flashbacks, and I had to figure out where do they go best? Do I need them at all? How do I line things up so that I can have my reveal at the end? And that one was like just incredibly difficult to revise. And I couldn't have done it until I'd written the whole thing. Whereas Furious Heaven, I had to get it lined up before I could write the rest. So it just depends on the book.
Coming back to a space opera again, what defines a space opera in your opinion? What are the essential elements?
I think the term space opera was originally meant in a derogatory way, but I think it's been reclaimed to have this kind of, to me, space opera, it needs to be big and have action. It could be battles, it could be adventure, it can move through, you can't really have a space opera to my mind when you're like in one setting. It's hard to have a space opera when you're only in the palace. You can have another kind of book like that, but not the space opera's got to be movement to me, because I think of it as a little bit like opera, which is like, it's a big stage and people are singing and it's often ridiculous. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's just because you're just like, everything is a little bigger than life. And to me, space opera is a little bigger than life. And if I can capture that, that's what I want. That's what I want to capture with space opera.
Well, what are the strengths and challenges to you as the storyteller in that space?
When I decided to do Alexander the Great as space opera, one of the things about the historical Alexander that space opera allows me to do is that they spent a long time on the move, that Alexander and his army, though they had to march from place to place, right? Or take a ship, but they marched mostly. And communications took a long time. And that was an element that mattered to me, not these generations, like it takes 100 years to get a message from this star to that star. So I made space opera adaptations of technology, which I made up. They're basically magic, right? But there's that sense that it will take a while for news from this planetary system to get to that planetary system, and that kind of replicates a bit of the historical aspect of how Alexander could hair off, and he was gone. I mean, he left Macedon. He never came back, and news would take weeks or months to get back to the palace and whoever was, and Antipater and Olympia. So I liked that aspect of it, because although it's tricky, because then I had to write a thing. How long would it take for this news to get here? And how long are they actually going? And sometimes I would fudge it. Okay, it's been a couple weeks. It's been a couple months. I don't know, 6 months have passed. I'm just going to say that. So
those plot elements really came right out of that. Historically, you pulled that to intentionally, and it informed the physics of the universe for your stories. Is the Alexander the Great kind of how it would have worked for him?
Yeah. Actually, I did that deliberately because I wanted kind of like a little callback to the history. The history actually really informs this series in many, 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 many ways. And people who know, you don't have to know the history. You don't have to know anything about the history to follow the story. But if you know the history well, you can see that, like, I'm hitting certain points or little funny little incidents, or which characters are analogs for which historical characters, and who's missing and why. So there's just a lot going on. It's just such a rich story.
And for those who don't know or didn't keep track of what we're talking about the Sun Chronicles series, the first book of which is The Unconquerable Sun, which came out in 2020, and Furious Heaven, which just came out last month. And is it going to keep going?
There is one more book. It's a trilogy.
Okay.
And I'm working on book 3 now, which is like even more complicated than book 2. So
that's exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to ask, but when do you think it might come out?
Unfortunately, it's probably going to be at least 2 years.
Yeah, no, it's not. And I'm sorry, like that's like twisting the
big
knife in a wound when you ask when is it going to be ready.
I wish I was one of those writers who could write a tight 90,000 word straightforward story with a heist with 6 characters, and and write it in 3 months and then revise it and then have it like come out at clockwork at every 9 months to a year or whatever. But this particular project it's just too complicated, and I would rather do it as well as I can than hurry it along. Because in the end, I'm the one who has to live with what gets published. I could write it faster and not get what I want, but I want to write the book I want to write. I want to get to the end and feel really satisfied. When the book comes out, when Furious Heaven came out, I said, this was the best book I could write at the time I wrote it. And it captured what I wanted to get. It has the things that I want it to have. How I'll feel about it in 5 years, who knows? But it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. So I want to do the same with book 3.
You sound very enthusiastic. You're very excited, and that makes us excited to read, and our listeners excited to read more of your work as well. When you're this focused on what you're writing right now, are you able to concentrate on those other stories that you're going to write in the future, or another novella? Do you have different pockets in your brain for the different stories that you want to write?
I'm like many writers that I know of, I've always got something else going on in the background. It might be like in the very early stages where it's just kind of, I just see kind of a glimmer back there. There's always something like that. And then there's something where bits and pieces of my mind are working on it occasionally. I have something like that right now where I might write some notes, or I might write a chapter, or every once in a while my brain will return to it. And it's kind of a break. It gives me a break from, it's like cross training, right? Let's talk, so if I'm training for a marathon, not that I would ever train for a marathon because I'm not a good runner, but if all I'd ever did was run, that would not be the best way to train. You would need your weight training, and you need your, whatever else, maybe some swimming, I don't know. But so to me, I think of it like cross training. And I have actually published in January 2023 and then last January 2 different novellas. Each one is in a completely different universe, and they're both fantasy. And I did those because the Sun books are very long, very complicated, huge cast of characters, these complex plots that interweave, and things that are set up early on come back. And I wanted to write something that I wanted to write a story in 40,000 words that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, a small cast of characters, a single goal. And that was a challenge for me because my brain tends to go big. It kind of want to add stuff in, but so for me, it was like, no, I'm just going to keep it small, So the first one is Servant Maid, which is a pretty much straight up fantasy. And then the second one is The Keeper Six, and it's the only contemporary fantasy I've ever written. It begins in Hawaii, but it turns out to be in contemporary Hawaii, but it turns out to be a portal fantasy, a multiverse fantasy. So those were a great change of pace for me, and they kind of gave me a little breathing space to be able to go back to the more complicated thing.
Both of which are available on Tor.com. And I think The Keeper 6 just was launched, you said January 2023, right?
Yeah, Keeper 6 is January 2023, and Servant Mage, which has this, well, both of them actually have phenomenally great covers. The Keeper, I'm sorry, I love cover art. I will never apologize for just fangirling over cover art. The Keeper 6 is by Emmanuel Shu, and The Servant Mage is by Tommy Arnold. The big dragon clutching this large glowing thing. It's so great.
How do you do that? Does the publisher work that out? And are you able to inform those covers at all?
No, I don't. Tor.com actually has a great art department. It depends on the publisher. Some publishers, back in the day, you would be sent your cover, and then you would just hope that it wasn't horrific, because, there are some really bad covers. And I think there were more bad covers 30 years ago than there are now, actually. So you didn't know what you would get. Then things, about 15 years ago, things changed. And in the case of both Unconquerable Sun and Furious Heaven, I did have some exchanges with my editor about those covers, especially with Furious Heaven. And there was a lot of work was done from the original sketch of that to the final cover. And I had actually a fair bit of input into what changes I thought were needed. But the two Tor.com covers, basically they just said, here's our artwork. What do you think? And they both blew me away. So I'm like, I don't need to be involved with this. They have better ideas than I did, because they really know what they're doing.
We hear that often with Tor.com. They just sound like a fantastic group of creative people, and it's
yeah, they're a really interesting experiment started about 10 years ago, I think, that has had quite a bit of success. So the Sun books are by Tor Books, which is a different entity than Tor.com, which did the novellas.
So I'm going to take a bit of a turn. For me, sci-fi, and I think for a lot of people, offers a peek at what the future might hold, but not just for science and technology. I feel lately we also get a chance to look at issues related to social justice and diversity. When you look back at your 30-year career, can you pinpoint a time or the time when publishers and readers became more receptive to voices that have been historically repressed?
I would say, so I think, well, I mean, obviously this is a constantly ongoing process, and the field has changed radically and remarkably and much for the better. Just in the time I've been publishing, there was an early shift in the aughts where one way to look at it, and kind of an easy way to look at it, is to look at award nominations. Who is deemed award worthy? Because a lot of people are writing good books. And so what awards do, like the Nebulas and the Hugos, really tell us what people think should be or could be on that ballot. And the Nebulas in the aughts, there was a shifting away from only people, there was a shifting to a younger group of people. So that was the first one where it was kind of like you didn't have to be old. You didn't have to be a baby boomer anymore to get an award. And then, of course, the infamous puppies, sad puppies, the whole thing that blew up with the Hugos, when there was this big shift in the Hugos and who was getting those award nominations. Now, obviously, people were publishing. Nora Jemison's first novel came out in either 2009 or 2010, I'm not sure which. That all kind of blew up in 2015, 2016, at which point I think that there just wasn't any question anymore that the field had expanded to see the universe, not just this one narrow view, but the whole universe. I think it's fantastic. I think we're seeing so much great work now. I love what's going on with the field now. especially compared to when 35 years ago. Although in the 80s and in the late 70s and the early 80s, and there was another big kind of explosion then, because that's when a big expansion then was when women were coming into the field in big numbers, although primarily white women. And that's, of course, I look at C.J. Cherryh, who's one of my formative influences. I love her work, and I was reading her work in the 70s and the 80s. She's just had a big impact on me in ways that I probably can't explain, but she was one of the first people who was just writing about, do you know the Morgaine series, the fantasy series, or she just was writing about stuff that I wasn't seeing other people writing about at that early on. Anyway, I think she's fantastic. Like Down Below Station, which won the Hugo back in, I don't even know when, 79, 80, 81.
And do you see that shift amongst your readers or other readers as well? Like when you see people who are buying your books, I mean, do you see changes around who's reading your work?
I think I've always had a fairly diverse readership. I hope so. I mean, it's hard for me right now. I can't really think before the pandemic, like,
it's hard. I know.
Yeah, like, did that even happen? Was that a different world? Maybe it was an alternate universe. I don't know. I think so. I think partly, I think the diverse readership was always there, but it wasn't really noticed. I remember so when I did The Golden Key with Jennifer Robertson and Melanie Ron, which was published in 1996, we did a little mini tour. And one of the places we went to for the tour was a comic and book shop in LA. And I had been to conventions, in the early 90s, and the conventions were pretty darn white. And then we went to this signing, and all of a sudden I was like, whoa, because it was LA, right? And for me, it was like, oh, hey, conventions don't really represent the people who are reading this, because LA is a very ethnically and racially diverse population. And there were as many, and that was when I realized how conventions were limiting in terms of what you thought the readership looked like and who you thought was writing. So that was a good wake-up call for me. And I think, and I hope I still have those readers and have expanded them. But and the other thing is that the buying power thing, right? So now people are like, we can buy these. I don't really know how to.
Well, and they see themselves, right? Tristan and I were hosting a session at a Comic-Con in Toronto a couple months ago, and one of the attendees said quite clearly, well, I only read contemporary stuff because if I want to see any female characters, they have to be in the last 15, 20 years, because I didn't see myself in those books. It was a lady who was mentioning this, and so that if people see themselves, if people can associate, if we've got more diverse characters, it draws in different audiences too. I think, right? Like that's my perception.
I agree. And there's actually another side to that as well. So part of it is seeing yourself in the book, because I certainly remember reading all these books. I mean, one of the reasons I started writing, quite honestly, was that like I was the kid I grew up in the time when a girl like me was called a tomboy, because I was always outdoors and I was climbing trees, and I didn't fit any of the parameters of femininity, which is what they were telling me. It just didn't interest me, and I wanted to go on adventures. And I was reading science fiction and fantasy from like 10 and 11, but it really bugged me that it was like girls didn't get to do that. That was what the stories told me. So when I started writing, I was like, well, I'm going to write and I'm going to put girls and women in these stories. But the flip side of that, so that's all great. That's fantastic. And I think it's really important, because the flip side of it is that then any reader will say, oh yeah, women belong in these stories. Black people belong in these stories. LGBTQ people belong in the world I live in. And opposed to thinking that the world is this narrow place and those people are, it's that thing where they say, well, back in back in the Middle Ages, women were all pregnant, illiterate peasant women who never went farther than 5 miles from their little slovenly hut, right? Someone actually said that to me, only they're wrong. So we as writers, or as whatever kind of creators, but we as writers have a chance to say, this is what the world's really like. All these people are there. It's just the stories left them out. So that to me is the flip side of that, is that it's a better view. It's a more realistic view of the world.
And a way to convey truth through fiction too,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of marvelous.
Well, I mean, a lot of people's expectations about the Middle Ages, right, come from Hollywood films, which really, or these weird ideas about the Middle Ages, which have nothing to do, often filtered through Disneyland and the Victorian era, right? And they have nothing to do with the Middle Ages. My sister's a medievalist, so it's just fiction can do so much. It can do harm, but it can also expand people's horizons.
You mentioned your sister's a medievalist,
Mm-hmm.
and you have an extensive fantasy catalog. And for what I consider added street cred in that genre, I understand that you were once an active member of the Society for Creative Anachronism.
Yeah,
I kind of have
I was just a stick jock, though. I just want to make that clear. I was in it to put on armor and bash people in the head.
That's okay. So now, are you still active?
Oh no.
Yeah. And so, what your weapon of choice? I take it was the sword and/or staff.
Sword and shield.
Sword and shield. Okay.
Yeah.
I like that. There's terminology. Stick jockey. Is there any other terms? Like if you have a mace, is there a nickname for that as well?
I don't know. I never fought with a mace.
No.
There actually weren't really maces were not that effective in terms of SCA combat.
Okay.
Yeah. Do any of you play RuneQuest?
No,
I don't.
Oh well.
I don't.
Oh, because the third edition, I think it's third edition or fifth edition. I think third edition RuneQuest cover is by Jody Lee, who since went on to do a lot of science fiction fantasy illustration for the major publishers. But I'm one of the models on the cover of that.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
that is pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, it's
That's very cool.
It's a fantastic cover. Yeah. Although strangely, I have a spear instead of a sword and shield, but oh well.
So you no longer bash people about the head with swords anymore. Literally, do you do it metaphorically now, or do you do it through your books, or what's your?
Well, I mean, I still write about war a lot in my books.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, yeah, and I just wanted to give a shout out here. I have 3 kids, all of whom are marvelous, but I just want to give a shout out to the one who's in the Navy, because all of the military stuff, any of it that I get right, and I actually get a lot of it right in Unconquerable Sun and Furious Heaven, because it's like a space Navy. It's due to the Navy boy, right? Because he'll go, well, this is something that they would say here, or this is the way they would do this process, or whatever. And so I just put those little details in. I don't know. So yeah,
That's cool. I was in the Navy years ago.
Oh, were you?
Yeah, U.S. Navy. I was stationed in Yokosuka, Japan, on the USS Independence, and worked on the flight deck of the carrier. But,
7th Fleet.
Yes.
Yeah. So my son was he's not now, he's with an air wing now, but he was with the 7th Fleet on the formerly known USS Chancellorville, now the Robert Smalls.
Ah.
Yeah. Then he was stationed in Yokosuka. Yeah.
Oh, no way. Yeah. So we would have probably hit the same ports then.
Well, the food, all the same good food, right?
Yeah, and you know, it's the ramen and yakisoba. I ate a lot of, and when I was in Japan, and if you're in the military and you're going to eat, and you're not in the Air Force, then you might as well eat the Navy food. It's better than sea rations and that sort of stuff, right? The MREs,
he went out on that. He went out on the economy. He I think he avoided shipboard food. I mean, I don't think it wasn't bad, but
no, it's not great. It's not good. I wouldn't recommend.
Yeah. I went to visit him, and he was like, all we basically did was go to restaurants he liked.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely. When you're in port, you just eat out all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's cool. Well, it's nice that you have that resource for your work, right?
It's fantastic, because I have to say that I do sometimes. I work real hard not to be critical publicly about things I read, because people work so hard on their books, and I know how hard it is, and I know how it sucks to get criticism, whether merited or unmerited, whatever. But I do sometimes read military stuff and I think, this just doesn't make sense. This person is just watching too many Hollywood films and thinking that that is real, and it's just not. So I am very grateful that he is willing to do that for me.
Well, if we can jump over, we were just talking about some really big boats. Let's talk about some small ones. So you get out on the water on kayaks and canoes, outrigger canoes. I want to know, how does being active in the outdoors, how does being in the ocean affect your writing? How does it inform your writing? And is it really important for you to be outside in order to get those creative juices flowing?
Well, I will try not to talk for an hour about outrigger canoeing, the state team sport in Hawaii. Actually, as much as people associate Hawaii with surfing, the outrigger canoe, of course, is how people got to Hawaii, and culturally, it's like incredibly important to the culture of Hawaii. And then it has since become, so you still have, I don't know if any of you are listening and you want to look up the Polynesian Voyaging Society and the history of the Hokulea and the different voyages of the Hokulea. It's fascinating stuff, which I won't go into here. But and that's a true voyaging canoe for long, long distances, and using celestial navigation as the Hawaiians would have done back in the day. But outrigger canoe paddling as a sport has been around, I don't know, probably 100 years or more. I'm sure it was done before. I'm sure it was always been a competitive sport because people like to race, right? But one of the things about outrigger canoes, which is that you have the canoe, but then you have a little float called the ama that's attached to the canoe by these kind of two, usually wooden things, like planks, I don't know, called the yako, right? And so what it does is it allows you to, because these are islands in the middle of the ocean and there's a lot of surf action, and that ama gives you stability. And that's why all the Pacific, the outrigger is as far as I know, a Pacific technology from the Pacific Ocean, and you find it all around, all through the Pacific Islands in New Guinea. So I don't know. I come from Viking stock back in the day. I'm Danish American all the way down both sides. My mom's an immigrant, and so I have a long. I think that I have a long. Oh, and I had a great grandfather who was a ship captain in the Faroe Islands. So I have a long association with water. It's in my blood. And when I got to Hawaii 20 years ago, like one of the first things I saw was this outrigger canoeing, and I was like, I have to do that. And for me as a human being, as person, I am an active person. I've always had to be an active person. If I can't be active, I get depressed. If I'm depressed and I go out on the water and the ocean is so beautiful here and the sky is beautiful and I'm with other people, that can like lift my spirits for hours afterwards. So I get that whole kind of adrenaline rush. And for me also, it's the only time I can disengage my brain, because if you're racing, you have to be in the moment. You can't be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. You can't be thinking about whatever was upsetting you. You have to be, especially the OC6, which are the 6-person canoe, because you've got to be moving in unison. So for me, it's a mental health thing. And then physically, it makes me feel better. And those things both directly impact my writing. That's the biggest. I mean, you said you're an outfitter, that you're outdoors all the time.
Yeah, canoes, kayaks, paddle boards.
Yeah.
I see a very important alignment to the outdoors and nature and science fiction. There's something we've talked to a couple other authors about this who are, like yourself, are outdoors, rock climbing or big hikers, and it informs a lot of writing. And I find that very interesting that nature affects how you would write space stories. There's something to be said about that.
I want to add, so that besides the fact that I've always been kind of an outdoor person and a water person, but I grew up in rural Oregon. And the other thing from growing up in farm country, the thing that influenced me most about all that is that I am like obsessed with agriculture and food sourcing. And every single book I write, at some point, there's always a mention of, food or fields or where, and not just food like we're going into a restaurant, but a sense that somebody knows where that food came from. And that's true in the space opera as well. There's a reference in Unconquerable Sun to sorry, I wrote that book so long ago that I can't remember everything. The squash beans, and what's the third one? It's the indigenous, the three that go together. Corn, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, there's a reference to fields. I mean, it's just all embedded in there. In a few works, I talk about agriculture more specifically because it specifically matters to the plot. But I always reference this idea that someone has to grow and tend the food. Otherwise, people can't eat, because I can't stand it when there's just like this assumption in like fantasy worlds where people just go to the inn and there's food, like going to the supermarket and there's food on the things, because we don't have that. A lot of people don't have that contact with the whole agricultural cycle. But I grew up with that around me. And so it really informs my writing.
Some people say that's where it was all downhill. Like, we're screwed. As soon as we figured out how to grow our own plants properly, like that's where it just like, we were all good until then. What do you say about that comment? It's
been said that hunter-gatherers only have to work like 18 hours a week by commodity time, right? Which may well be true if you're living in a good area and there's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of stuff to gather, and there's things to, fish and whatever. And agriculture brought its own downsides with it as well. But I don't know. I'm not one to. I think we got to move forward from where we are, and where we are is here, and that all happened. So here we are. We got it. We have a lot of issues to deal with in the future. Actually, from an earlier comment about that Sam made about what can narrative do, and narrative, instead of talking about the future as collapse and dystopia, I would love to see, and sometimes see, narrative that talks more about how are we going to get through this? What kind of world could we build that won't be so destructive? So narrative can do a lot.
Well, Kate, it has been a real pleasure speaking with you and having you on. And I wonder if there is anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about.
I just am so intrigued, actually, by something you said before we started recording, that the three of you had a book club. And then you got online, and then the pandemic hit, and then this came out of it.
Yeah, that's sort of our genesis is this. It was the pandemic, and it's turned into a pretty cool hobby in a way that sort of, we have, I mean, Tristan and I both I worked for years in public broadcasting, and Tristan handles a lot of this, and Kevin's the smart one. And
is that true, Kevin?
Not true.
Is that true?
It's not true at all.
100%. 100% the case. But it's and it's been a lot of fun to sort of make something and create something out of an otherwise very difficult time. And it's been a really nice journey. And I know things have sort of subsided pandemic wise, but this has definitely been a great outcome, because I think for us, when we first started, it was a sci-fi book club. We was, I come from a fantasy background, and Kevin was like, oh, I got to start a sci-fi book club. Are you in? And I was, and a couple other people joined up, and then it kind of grew from there. And then it sort of refined itself over the past 2 years. Tristan is an excellent chase producer and is great at getting authors on, and we do book reviews. So we sort of have a magazine format where we pick a book of the month and we review it, and then we talk about it. And Kevin does a segment about science fiction and science fact, we call it, and things that are happening in the news, and we talk about we'll do a segment where we talk about what we're watching or reading and other things as well. And then we usually publish about twice a month, and we'll do the magazine format, and then we'll follow a couple weeks later with an interview. And people have been really generous with their time and coming on, and it's been pretty great. It sort of stumbled into a pretty willing community and an open-minded demographic, I think, particularly with the sci-fi and fantasy authors.
And the shift as well has been a book club is very self-serving, right? It's for us. We're interested in talking about it.
Mhm.
This is as a mechanism for doing that same type of discussion, but making it value creating for others, right? Value creating perhaps for our subset of listeners who tend to be fairly hardcore around sci-fi, but sometimes value creating for authors too, when they come on and they can talk about their work and gain an audience. So it's an interesting shift, like to try to create value for different stakeholders.
I think that it's also interesting in terms of the pandemic, when people suddenly realized about how I mean, people have always known humans are banned animals or whatever. We not every person, obviously, but people thrive on connection, and these kind of things create connection. People are like, oh, well, I'm going to listen to that podcast every week, right? And then they kind of build that sense, these little different communities, maybe at a time like you came on the scene at a time when people were feeling isolated, and then they could hook into this, which I think is fascinating, and part of as part of what people do to kind of connect, whether it's art, whether it's this, right?
It's hard to connect around sci-fi related stuff sometimes, right? Unless you're an author, it's sometimes hard to be part of a community. So this is one of the few locations for that niche to be kind of scratched a bit.
Yeah.
You really seem like an optimist, Kate. You see the good that comes out of the bad, and that's something that we've been talking about a lot on the show lately. Is a lot of the books that we're reading are low stakes. They're optimistic. They're the themes are sympathy, empathy, and we've said this, and I'm regurgitating this once again, but I'm getting a little bit tired with the kicking and punching and all these movies and TV shows and the guns and all this stuff. I think we're fine with just watching humans do good things, and I wonder if this is a bit of a revolution in media. Is that we just want to see people doing good things, and there's a few shows and books that we've seen that just celebrate that, and I do think there's a market for that. There doesn't have to be conflict all the time.
I think that in the 30s, when Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers were like the big movie box office with their fluffy, light, romantic comedies with dancing and great songs by, the great songwriters of that era, like Irving Berlin and George Gershwin. Yes, I have seen all the Astaire Rogers films more than once back in the day. Not when they came out, though. But yeah, I think that we're in a tough time, and I think people feel exhausted. And, for me, I recently started a couple of different series on whatever, Netflix or Prime or whatever, right? And they started with fighting and whatever. And I'm like, I don't want to see this anymore. I've seen this a million times. They're not, and I'm tired. I'm worn out. Give me something that shows people connecting with each other. And so I do think that is something coming up now, because we have a lot to be worried about. And there's a reason that YA dystopia got so big, because I don't know, if I was Gen Z or what's the one below them, Gen Alpha, what a time, right? Yeah. Bad enough for millennials. My kids are all millennials. Bad enough for millennials, but so no wonder they look at the world and go, this is not good. So I'm glad. Am I optimistic? I don't know, but I feel like I have a responsibility to the future to think about how it can be built in a way that helps as many people as possible, all people, if possible, as opposed to being cynical. So that's why I approach. I don't know what's going to happen, but I feel like that's something I can do.
It's interesting you point out, like it was during a lockdown and through this medium that we were able to probably connect with more people
Yes.
than
Yeah.
we ever have, would have otherwise. We would have just been having a book club at the pub over chicken wings and beer once a month, right? Like that's what it would have been. So
Yeah.
It gives, and people's willingness to come on and join and listen gives me that kind of hope that there's the necessary pessimism, because people want to get back to optimism, right? They want to find that path back to just a more civil place.
They want to believe there is a future.
Mm.
And and that we can work towards it. That's what I think. And that's what I think that narrative and shows like this can all do. Just create that connection, create that pathway.
Or books like yours, Kate.
Yes.
With Furious Heaven, just launched last month.
And has a ton of war in it. So many battles. So I don't know.
Oh, you still got to have fun, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It's not so fun. I don't actually write it as fun, but but it has but the thing about writing, I'm sorry to come back to this the thing about writing a story with many strands is that you can show other kinds of things going on. So it isn't, I'm not solely writing from the point of view of the main character, right? I'm showing all this other stuff going on around it, which is kind of a commentary on and a window into that these things affect multiple people in different ways and that people have different goals. So
yeah. And Sam's profound statement, which I thought was really good, is we have to have that necessary pessimism to get to that optimism, right? We need to sometimes we need to bust some heads to get there.
That's right.
Anyway, and I also noticed that your the audiobooks for Keepers 6 and Furious Heaven were released on Audible last month as well. And and so those who want to listen can also enjoy your latest work.
Yeah, and a lot of my work is my backlist is now starting to come out in audio because of MP3s. So it's been fantastic for with the audio boom. The audiobook boom has been also great.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It certainly broadens it to a lot of different people who can't always take the time to sit down and read. They can reclaim some time by listening while they're doing other things.
Like commuting to their job.
Right. Yep.
Well, thank you, Kate. This has been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Definitely.
You've been spectacular. I really appreciate it. And I just love that this is something that came out of the pandemic.
Something good came out of it.
Something. Well, you notice I didn't say whether it was good or ill, right?
Oh, right. Something did come out.
That's right.
Something came out.
That's right.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed that one. Next episode is going to be the book of the month, where we're talking about Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds. We'll probably have a lot more to talk about. We've got more special episodes coming up soon. More interviews, all kinds of exciting stuff. Thanks for sticking with us today. Until next time.